The door was iron, but no one had built a road to it. That was the thing the boy could not get past, standing in the river fog at first light. The trestle above him was a known thing, 80 feet of black timber stitched across the gorge, a logging spur that had been quiet since the mill closed in 1978. Anyone with a topographic map could find it. What no map showed was the iron door set flush into the stone abutment at the base of the western pier, a foot above the high water line, painted the same wet slate color as the rock. No path led to it. No hinges faced the river. And yet someone, sometimes, had carried hinges and rivets and a 41-pound iron plate down the screen and fitted them into the cliff as if they were meant to be forgotten. He had been walking the rail bed for 9 days when he saw it. He was 20 years old and had been alone, in the practical sense of the word, for 14 months. The state had let him out of the system on a Tuesday in April with a duffel bag, a copy of his birth certificate, and the address of a transitional housing office that had closed 2 years earlier and not been updated on the paperwork. He had stood on the sidewalk for a long time that morning, and then he had begun to walk, and in some way he had not really stopped. He carried a green canvas pack that weighed 38 pounds full and 22 empty. Inside it, a wool blanket rolled tight enough to fit beside a 1-quart steel pot, a folding knife with a bone handle that had been his grandfather's, a tin of waterproofed matches, a small notebook with a rubber band around it, a pencil sharpened with the knife, 2 pairs of socks, a tarp the size of a tablecloth, a length of paracord, and a tin cup that had once held condensed milk and now held nothing except the smell of campfires. He carried a quart canteen on his belt. He carried, in the chest pocket of his jacket, a photograph of a woman he could not quite remember, whose handwriting on the back said June, behind the house. There was no house in the photograph. There was only June. He had taught himself, in those 14 months, to do everything slowly. He had learned that hurrying was how a person on foot got hurt. He boiled water before he drank it, even when the stream looked clean. He cut his food into small pieces and ate them one at a time. He set up his tarp the same way every night, 4 corners staked, ridgeline tied to whatever was tallest, and he laid out his sleeping things in the same order so that in the dark, his hand always knew where the knife was and where the matches were. He had read somewhere that habit was the orphan's house. He thought about that sometimes when he was tying knots. He had been following the old branch line for a reason that was difficult to say out loud. In one of the foster homes, when he was 12, there had been a man, not a father, not unkind, who had worked 36 years on the railroads and who told stories at the kitchen table about lines that did not exist anymore. He had drawn one of them on the back of a placemat with a blue ballpoint pen, a line that ran up a river gorge and crossed it twice on timber trestles and then died at an abandoned mill. That country, the man had said, tapping the placemat, is the loneliest country in the world. A man could live a whole life back there, and nobody would put his name on a piece of paper. The boy had kept the placemat. He had been keeping it for 8 years. When the state let him out, he went looking for the line on the placemat, because the line was the only address he had been given that did not turn out to be closed. He had found the railbed 3 weeks ago, 60 miles back, where the rust-orange stain of old ballast leaked out of a hillside into a logging road. He had been walking it since. He slept under his tarp at night and walked from first light until his shadow turned long. And every morning the gorge got deeper around him, and the air got colder and wetter, and the fog began earlier in the day and burned off later, until on the 9th morning it did not burn off at all. That was the morning he came around the bend and saw the trestle. He had heard about it without ever quite hearing about it, the kind of structure that exists in 2 or 3 sentences of a county history and nowhere else. It was longer than he had imagined, and lower, the deck only 80 feet above the river, but the river itself sunk so deep into the rock that the trestle seemed to bridge a wound rather than a valley. The timbers were black with creosote and 100 winters of rain. The rails were still on it. He could see them, 2 thin lines on the deck up above, gone soft and red with rust. They had not carried a train since before he was born. He left the railbed and worked his way down the scree to the river. He did this carefully, sideways, the way he had learned. At the bottom, the air changed. The fog was thicker here, sitting on the water like cotton wool, and the sound was different. The river was very close and very loud, and the gorge walls threw back every drop of it. He drank from the canteen and ate a strip of jerky and sat down on a flat rock to look up at the trestle. That was when he saw the door. He looked at it for a long time before he understood what he was looking at. The western abutment of the trestle was not the usual concrete poured form, but a piece of natural stone, a kind of shoulder of the gorge wall that the builders had taken advantage of. Bolts had been driven into the rock to anchor the lower bents. Iron rungs climbed it in a ladder. None of that was strange. What was strange was a panel of darker color, slightly recessed, about 3.5 feet wide and a little under 6 feet tall, set into the face of the stone at the height of a man's chest. It had no handle. It had no visible hinges. It had been painted, and the paint had been chosen well, and over the years moss had crept across its lower edge, so that at first glance it was simply another patch of cliff. But he had been walking 9 days alone, and the eye that has nothing to look at notices everything. He saw the seam. He stood up. He took a slow breath. He walked toward it. The river was very loud now, and the fog was very thick, and somewhere, in the way fog has of holding sound and releasing it strangely, he thought he could hear a low humming. It might have been the wind in the trestle timbers. It might have been the river finding a new channel through a stone. He told himself it was one of those things and not the other. The thing that the railbed had been training him to listen for, the whole 9 days without his admitting it. He reached the iron door. He laid the flat of his hand on it. It was cold. It was honestly cold, the cold of metal that has been hidden from the sun for a long time. He felt along the seam with his fingertips. The hinge pins were on the inside. That was a careful choice. That was the choice of someone who did not want the door pried open from the riverside, by water or by curiosity. He found, low on the right edge, a depression in the iron about the size and shape of a wood screw head, and inside the depression, a square hole the size of a pencil. He took his folding knife out and opened the smaller blade and fitted it into the square hole. He did not turn it yet. He stood with his hand on the knife and listened to the humming. It was louder now, or his ear had found it, and there was a quality to it he did not like. It was not the wind. It was not the river. It was a tone, single and held, the way iron sings when something heavy is moving on it, a long way off. He looked up at the rails. They were rust-red and old, and could not possibly carry anything. He told himself this twice. A reasonable person, he thought, would turn back from a door in a cliff in a fog with a sound in the rails overhead. A reasonable person would mark the place on his map and walk the 11 miles back to the last road and come again in summer with a friend and a flashlight. He had no friends. He had no flashlight beyond the small one in his pack. He had only 9 days of walking behind him, and the line on the placemat, and the photograph of June behind a house that was not there. He turned the knife. The iron door did not swing. It dropped. The top edge tipped outward by a fraction. The bottom edge anchored on a pivot he hadn't seen. The whole plate moving as a counterweighted hatch that an aging man could open with one hand. It came to rest at a tilt, and behind it was darkness. And out of the darkness came a smell he had not smelled in 14 months. The smell of a place where someone has lived. Tar paper, wood smoke, long cold dry paper, machine oil, the faint sweetness of stored apples. Not the smell of a cave, the smell of a house. He stepped back. He looked up at the trestle. Above him, at the far end of the deck, where the rails ran into the fog and disappeared, a light had appeared. It was small and white, and steady, and it was, unmistakably, the round single eye of a locomotive headlight, set high above the rails, and as he watched it grew brighter, and the humming in the iron grew louder, and there was, now, no question at all about what he was hearing. He could feel it in the soles of his boots. The deck above him was beginning to tremble. He stood at the foot of the cliff with his hand on the open door and his mouth open, and no thought in his head whatever, except the simple and absurd one: there are no trains on this line. The headlight came on. The humming rose. The trestle began to thrum the way a wire thrums when a heavy bird lands on it, and a fine dust of creosote and dry rot began to sift down out of the timbers and settle on his shoulders. He went through the door. He did it without deciding to do it. He went through the door and turned and reached back and lifted the iron plate by the inside handle that was waiting where his hand expected it to be, and he set it back into its frame, and a small iron lever inside the door dropped into a notch with a soft final sound, and the door was closed, and he was inside the rock. For a long minute he stood with his back against the iron and breathed. The trembling came through the stone. He could feel it in his shoulder blades. Whatever was on the deck above him passed slowly, a long pulse of sound and pressure that went on longer than any train he had ever seen, and then went thinner, and then went away, and the humming dropped out of the iron, and there was only the river again, far away now and muffled, and the slow drumming of his own heart in his ears. He waited. He counted to 100, and then to 200. Then he took the small flashlight out of his pack and turned it on. The beam showed him a corridor, cut into the rock. It was narrow, perhaps 3 feet wide, and the walls bore the diagonal striations of a star drill and hammer, and they had been smoothed afterward with a chisel, and the chisel marks had been smoothed in turn by the slow passage of hands along them. Someone had walked this corridor enough times to wear it down. He took 5 steps. He took 10. The corridor turned to the right and dropped 2 steps and opened into a room. The room was 12 feet by 14. He measured it later, with his own feet, heel to toe. It had been cut entirely from the stone and finished by a careful person. The floor was flat. The ceiling was vaulted slightly, so that water would not pool. In the wall opposite him there was a small iron stove, no bigger than a milk crate, with a flue that disappeared into the stone above it. He understood without thinking that the flue would emerge somewhere on the cliff face high above, where its smoke would mingle with river mist and never be seen. Against the right-hand wall was a built-in bunk with a striped wool blanket folded at its foot. Against the left, a plank table and a single chair. Above the table, a kerosene lantern hung on an iron hook. Above the bunk, a shelf of books. On the floor by the stove, a wooden crate of split fur, dry as paper. It was a home. It had been somebody's home. He stood in the doorway with the small flashlight in his hand, and he did not move for a long time. He had been ready when he turned the knife for many things. He had been ready for a maintenance closet. He had been ready for a smuggler's cache. He had been ready for nothing, and for bones, and for the wet stink of a place that had given up. He had not been ready for the wool blanket folded as if for a guest. The lantern had a box of matches sitting next to it on the shelf. He lit it. The room came up out of the dark, slowly the way a photograph comes up in Developer, and details began to arrive that the flashlight had missed. A row of glass jars on a wall-mounted shelf, each one with a paper label in a careful hand. A pair of rubber boots upside down on a peg by the stove, sized for a small man. A tin coffee pot on the stovetop, washed clean, set with its lid off so the inside would dry. A calendar pinned to the wall above the table, turned to the month of May, the year 1971, with a single date, May 14th, circled in pencil. He sat down in the chair, because his legs would not hold him. He took off his pack and set it on the floor, and he sat at the plank table for a while, with his hands flat on its surface, and he tried to think. The table had been planed by hand, and the grain ran lengthwise. There were 2 small notches at the front edge, where someone had habitually rested a knife. There was a ring of dark stain near the right corner where a coffee cup had sat, again and again in the same place. There were, when he looked carefully, the faintest impressions of letters scratched into the wood at the back edge of the table, where the lamplight fell most weakly. 2 initials, E.H., cut shallow with the point of a small blade, the way a man cuts initials when he is alone and wishes to leave a small mark and does not want to insist on it. He said the initials out loud. His voice in the room was strange to him. It had been 4 days since he had spoken to anyone, including himself. He looked, then, properly. He gave himself permission to look. On the shelf above the bunk, there were 9 books. 8 of them were railroad manuals: bridge inspection, track maintenance, signaling, the Manual for Railway Engineering of 1957, and the 9th was a Bible bound in black cloth, soft with use. Behind the books, leaned against the wall, was a roll of paper tied with string. He took it down. He untied the string. He unrolled it on the table under the lantern. It was a hand-drawn plan of the room he was sitting in. The plan was drawn in pencil on a piece of heavy cream paper, the kind of paper that surveyors used in the 1950s, and it was drawn beautifully. Every dimension was marked. The vault of the ceiling was shown in section. The flue was drawn going up through 11 feet of rock and emerging at a vent, disguised as a weathered drainage opening in the abutment, 42 feet above the river. The bunk, the stove, the table, the shelf, all of them were drawn in plan and elevation. In the lower right corner of the paper, in a small box, were the words, "Section House, Pier Number 1 West, E. Hollister, Resident Engineer," and below that, Spring 1959. He sat for a long time with the plan under his hands. He understood, slowly, what he was looking at. A resident engineer for the railroad, the man whose job it was to walk the line and inspect the trestles, had built himself a hidden room inside the western abutment of this bridge in 1959 and had used it as a section house. Officially, there had never been a section house here. The line was too short and too remote, and the company had not paid for one. Unofficially, E. Hollister had taken his star drill and his hammer, and on long Saturdays through the spring of 1959, he had carved one for himself out of the rock. And he had drawn it. And he had drawn it well, the way a man draws something he loves. But the calendar on the wall said 1971. 12 years after the plan was drawn, May 14th, circled. He stood up. He went to the row of jars on the shelf. Each jar held food, sealed under wax. The labels were dated. Apples, dried, Aug 1970. Beans, dry, Sept 1970. Lard, rendered, Octorwin 1970. The wax was unbroken. The food, when he lifted a jar, was still sweet inside. Someone had laid in a winter's worth of supplies in the fall of 1970, and then, evidently, had not stayed to eat them. On the bottom shelf, behind the jars, there was a small tin box. He took it down. He opened it on the table. Inside, on top, was a photograph. It was black and white, and creased along one edge from being carried in a pocket. It showed a man of about 50, standing on the deck of the trestle, with his hand on a wooden railing. He was small, narrow-shouldered, wearing a work shirt, buttoned to the throat, and a soft-billed cap. He was not smiling, exactly, but his eyes were content. On the back of the photograph, in the same careful hand that had drawn the plan and labeled the jars, were the words, "Self, West Deck, Spring 1959. Good year." Beneath the photograph was a list. It was a single sheet of the same cream paper, folded twice. The list was a column of place names, small towns, the kind of towns that no longer appear on state maps. Colmont, Sweetwater, Drumheller Bend, Two Rivers, Lone Pine. Beside each town was a small notation in pencil. Yes, yes, no. Moved on. Yes, not yet. 5 towns. 3 yeses, 1 no, 1 not yet. At the bottom of the list, underlined twice, was a single line: "If empty, try the lookout." Key on the ring. Beneath the list, at the bottom of the tin box, was a ring of keys. 6 of them, of varying ages. Each key had a small paper tag tied to it with thread. The tags bore the same town names as the list. He sat back in the chair and put both hands flat on the table. He was beginning, dimly, to see the shape of it. Hollister had built this room for himself in 1959, and then, at some point, the meaning of the room had changed. The jars dated 1970. The calendar is set to May 1971. A list of towns with the question yes or no against each one. A note: "If empty, try the lookout." A ring of keys to places he had never been. If empty. If empty of what? He read the list again. The pencil marks beside each town did not say yes or no to a question about whether the town existed. They said yes and no to a question about whether someone had been there. Hollister had been looking for someone. Or rather, Hollister had been looking for someone who might come here, and when they were not in the section house, he had gone out into the country one town at a time to find them. Sweetwater, yes. Drumheller Bend, no. Moved on. Two Rivers, yes. And at the bottom of the page, if empty, try the lookout. There was no name on the list of who he was looking for, but the room itself was the answer to that question. A bunk made up with a blanket. Jars of food sealed for a winter. A stove laid with fur. A lantern lit with a fresh match from a box that someone had thought to leave. The room was set, the way a table is set, for a guest who had not yet arrived. The boy slept that night in the bunk. He did not mean to. He sat at the table for a long time, reading the labels on the jars again, and then the bridge inspection manual, and then a few pages of the Bible, which fell open at the place where the spine had been most often broken. The Book of Ruth. He read the part about whither thou goest. He read it twice, and then, without meaning to, he put his head down on his forearm at the table and slept for an hour, and woke stiff, and lay down in the bunk with the blanket over him, and slept the rest of the night. In the morning, in the lamplight, the door was still shut, and time inside the rock did not move. He made coffee on the iron stove with grounds from a sealed tin dated September 1970, and drank it from the tin cup that had been waiting upside down on the shelf, and decided that he would go to the lookout. The list said, if empty, try the lookout. The note had been written for someone, by someone, decades ago. Both of them, almost certainly, were now dead. The boy understood that. He was not confused about it, but the room had been left set for a guest, and he had become the guest, and he found that he did not want to break the chain of what Hollister had begun. He would go to the lookout. He would see what was there. He would come back. He chose the smallest key on the ring, the one whose paper tag said lookout, in pencil, in Hollister's hand, and he put it in his pocket, and he put the photograph and the list back in the tin box and the tin box on the shelf, and he banked the stove, though there was no fire in it, and he blew out the lantern, and he opened the iron door and stepped out into the morning. The fog had thinned. The river was lower. The trestle was as it had been, still and empty, the rails still rust-red. No headlight, no humming. He stood at the foot of the cliff for a moment, looking up at the deck, and he thought about the thing he had heard the night before, and he decided, calmly, that he did not know what it had been, and that he might never know, and that this was acceptable. Not every question in a country like this had to be closed. He closed the iron door behind him. The scene disappeared. He walked. The plans had shown him, in their meticulous way, where the lookout was. Hollister had drawn a small inset map in the corner of his section house plan, marking a footpath that ran from the western abutment up the gorge wall on a switchback, and then north along the rim for 2 miles, to a point where the original surveyors of the line, in 1947, had built a lookout shed on a granite outcrop. The shed had been used to spot rockfalls onto the rails below. After the line went quiet, no one had used it for anything at all. Hollister, it seemed, had used it for something. The footpath was where the plan said it would be. It had been cut by hand, narrow and switchbacked, with stone steps in the steepest places. Some of the steps had been laid recently enough that the boy could see the chisel marks. Others were softened by moss. The path had been maintained by someone over decades, and then had been left to itself for what looked like a generation. He climbed for an hour. The fog dropped below him. The gorge opened out beneath him like a long stone room, with a river at its bottom. He could see the trestle from above for the first time, a black line across the wound in the country. And from this angle he could see, too, that the rails on the deck were not in fact continuous. There was a gap of perhaps 8 feet halfway across where 2 rails had been pulled and not replaced. Nothing could have crossed that bridge on rails the night before. Nothing on wheels. He stood at the switchback and looked at the gap for a long time. He thought about iron singing in the cold. He thought about how sound moves in a gorge in fog. He thought about how a man hears what he is listening for. He did not, in the end, come to a conclusion. He went on. At the top of the rim, the path turned north and ran along a narrow shelf of granite for 2 miles. Easy walking, the trees small and wind-bent, the air bright and cold. He came to the lookout shed an hour before noon. It was a small square building, 8 feet by 8, with a steep tin roof and a single door and a single window that faced south down the gorge. It had been built in 1947, just as the plan had said, by men whose names were nowhere written. It had a padlock on its door, an old brass padlock pitted with rain. The key from Hollister's ring opened it. Inside, the lookout was almost bare. A wooden stool, a small writing desk under the window. On the desk, a notebook, bound in oilcloth, weighted with a smooth river stone. Pinned to the wall above the desk, a topographic map of the gorge with small pencil marks at intervals along the rail bed. The place where the trestle was, the place where the iron door was, and other places too. 4 or 5 of them, each marked with a small square and a number. The boy understood, looking at the map, that the section house under the trestle had not been the only one. Hollister had built others. There were rooms in the rock, all up and down this line. Hidden houses, maintained by one small, narrow-shouldered man with a star drill for 30 years. He sat down on the stool. He opened the notebook. The first page was dated April 1959. The handwriting was the same handwriting he had seen on the photograph and on the plan and on the labels of the jars. The first entry said, "Began the work at Pier Number 1 West today. 6 hours. The rock is harder than I hoped. I will go slowly. There is no hurry. I am building a place where no one will be turned away." The boy read that line 3 times. He kept reading. The notebook was not a diary. It was a register. Hollister had written 1 short entry every time he completed a room. And then, in the years after, 1 short entry every time he had a guest. The entries were dated. They were brief. October 1962. A man came in off the rails in the snow. Stayed 11 days. Took a blanket and a pair of boots when he went. Left $2 on the table. I put the dollars back in the jar by the stove for the next one. November 1964. A boy of about 16. He would not say his name. He stayed until spring. He left without taking anything. I hope he found the next room. June 1968. A woman and a child. She had walked from Lona Pine. They stayed the summer. I never asked her anything. She left in September, and I think she went south. The entries went on for pages. They went on for years. 12 years of entries. 12 years of guests, one at a time, drifting in off the railbed in the fog, and finding a door no map showed, and a blanket folded at the foot of a bunk, and jars of food sealed under wax. Each one stayed for a while. Each one went on. Some left a few dollars, some left nothing. Some left a small note, which Hollister had copied into the notebook in his careful hand. "Thank you. A. I was at the end of it. M. I will not forget." No initial. The last entry was dated May 12, 1971. It read, "Tired today. Heart not steady. I will rest at Pier Number 1 West for a few days. I have left the door unlatched. If anyone comes and I am not there, the keys are in the tin. The room is yours, for as long as you need it. After me, the rooms will keep themselves only if someone is willing. E.H." There was a blank line. Below the blank line, in a different hand, a younger hand, hurried, written in pencil that had not been sharpened, was a single later entry, dated only autumn, undated. It said, "I came in October. He was gone. I buried him on the rim above the trestle, where he liked to sit. I have stayed through the winter. I will go out in the spring. I will tell no one. If you are reading this, you found the door. The door has been waiting for you. T." And then, beneath that, in a third hand, dated 1979, came through, "Stayed a month, going on. R." And then, 1983, and 1986, and 1991, and 1996. The hands changed. The pencil changed. The entries got shorter, then they stopped. The last one was dated October 2002, in handwriting that was old and slow. "I am the last for a while, I think. The path is getting hard for me. I am leaving the keys where they were. Someone else will come. F. The boy closed the notebook and put his hands flat on the desk. He sat for a long time in the lookout, with the south light on his hands. He understood now what he was holding. He understood what he had walked 9 days to find, without knowing he was walking toward it. A man had built rooms in the rock, so that nobody who came down that line in the fog would ever be turned away. The man had died, and someone had buried him, and that someone had stayed, and gone on, and left the door for the next one, and the next, and the next. For 24 entries across 43 years, the rooms had kept themselves, because each guest had been willing. He took the pencil from the desk. He sharpened it with his knife. He opened the notebook to the first blank page. He wrote the date. He wrote, in the careful hand of someone who has been taught that writing is a kind of work, I came in the fog. I heard something on the rails. I am not sure what it was. The door was where the plan said it would be. The blanket was folded. The jars were sealed. I will stay for the winter. I will mend the flue at Pier Number 1 West. The draft is poor. I will check the other rooms on the map when the weather allows. If you are reading this, you found the door. The door has been waiting for you. He did not sign it. He thought about it, and he did not sign it. There would be time, later, for an initial. He sat for a while longer in the small, bright room. Then he closed the notebook and set the stone on top of it, and locked the lookout behind him, and started down the path toward the trestle and the iron door, and the room that, now, in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork, had become his to keep. That night he banked a small fire in the iron stove. The flue did, as he had suspected, draw poorly. He would fix it in the morning. He ate a little of the dried apple from the jar dated August 1970, and it was still sweet, and he sat at the plank table and read another page of the bridge inspection manual by lantern light, and he listened to the river running far away through the rock, and he was, for the first time in 14 months, and perhaps for the first time in his life, not lonely. Before he slept, he took the photograph out of his chest pocket, the one of June, behind the house that wasn't there, and he set it on the shelf above the bunk, beside the books. It looked there, as if it had always been there, as if the shelf had been waiting for it. In the morning, he would mend the flue. After that, he would walk the line north and find the next room on the map, the one Hollister had marked with the number 2. He had the ring of keys. He had the list of towns. He had a notebook and a pencil. He had a 38 pounds of pack and a habit of doing things slowly. But there was one thing he had not yet understood, and he knew it, and he was content to let it wait. On the inside of the iron door, where his eye had not gone the night he came in, there was a second set of initials cut into the metal beside Hollister's. Initials he had glimpsed that morning on his way out, and had not stopped to read. They were not E.H. They were older than E.H. They had been there before the door was painted, and the paint had been laid carefully around them, as if to keep them. He would look at them tomorrow, in the lamplight, when the flue was drawing clean. He turned down the lantern. The room went dark. Somewhere far above him, in the fog on the deck of the bridge, the rails were quiet, and the gorge was quiet, and the door in the rock was shut, and the blanket was folded at the foot of the next bunk, and was waiting.